back to the Scarlet Faithful podcast. It's been a while, but here with David Anderson, we've been wanting to get together and kind of touch on the 2026 recruiting class for Rutgers football as it stands. There was some little bit of action there in the end of June, built the class in the beginning of June. We've seen the footprint for Rutgers over the last few years, really taking advantage of that June period of having so many visits and getting so many commits in one period. Did have a few decommits at the end of the month. Here we are now in a dead period. Rutgers with 21 commits currently. Right now with 24/7 composite rankings sitting at 29 nationally, 11th in the Big Ten. David, kind of what are some of your initial thoughts or players? Let's start with players that stand out to you in this class right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's three of the guys who are earlier commits that are the most important in terms of having playmakers. Koch, Collier, and Carter, right? So Dysere Carter, the wide receiver, highest rated guy in the class by every source. YD Collier, the 6'7" edge rusher, which is something that they're really struggling to find. And then Elias Koch, who I think was a guy that kind of symbolizes where Rutgers was a little ahead of the curve. I think they were on him a little earlier than a lot of other teams. A guy like that, my only question is kind of along the lines of Ian Strong, where he's like big, strong, and fast, but like, are his hands going to be good enough to be a possession receiver? If yes, he could be a monster. So those are the three guys who I kind of you look at, and then the other two, I guess, that jump out to me the most are Tavion Branch, because he just has such a quick first step for a guy his size, and we've seen how much better the Rutgers defense is when they have a guy in the middle who can be disruptive, have that really quick first step. Even if they're undersized, like when they had Julius Turner, it still was kind of dictating to the offense. And then the last guy who really intrigues me the most is, probably both the offensive linemen, but probably Jared Smith, because it seems like on the offensive line, they're getting these smart, polite, articulate guys who also play with a mean streak. Sometimes we kind of conflate that, like, if you're too nice, you're not like a mauler, or like you don't have that like killer instinct. And I think that might have been one of the things they maybe misevaluated or oversimplified with Raekwon O'Neal, which caused him to depart. Like, that doesn't necessarily mean they're mutually exclusive. And so it seems like on the offensive line, they're kind of like finding the guys that have the measurables and then have the personality off the field to get better, but the personality on the field to go out and hit people. And so that kind of triangle on the offensive line is really what they need to raise the level of play of that group. So those are just some of the ones that jump out at me. Were there other ones that jumped out at you for a variety of reasons?
Yeah, I think one recruit that got a lot of hype coming in and obviously has a lot of speed is Chris Hewitt Jr., from Maryland. Obviously, family ties to Rutgers, and a lot of people were high on him. I think, his potential in the secondary for Rutgers is really intriguing. I think he's a player that could end up playing pretty early in his career as well. But, you touched on, I think, a lot of really good players. I just think it's interesting how at the front of the class now, Rutgers is getting more speed. They're getting more athletes. They're getting more offensive skill players in terms of wide receivers than they have typically. Now, the last 2 years, they're really starting to stack it there. Of course, position group-wise, they still loaded up on an offensive and defensive line. I mean, that has to be the standard, I think, year after year, trying to compete in the Big Ten, needing to build up yourself on the line of scrimmage. It's a constant battle, constant development. But, yeah, you mentioned Collier. I mean, 6'7" athlete, edge rusher. Obviously, he's pretty thin, 215, needs a lot of, strength and development there. But he is certainly very intriguing on film, and someone that I think, it kind of keeps that Philly pipeline going, and someone that, depends on if he is an early enrollee, can he then make an impact as a freshman? I think that'll be key. I mean, nowadays, too, it's like 75% of the class enrolls early anyway. So you'd have to think that a lot of the guys at the top of the class, they're prioritizing to get in here early. But I thought just in terms of what they did position group wise, not surprising. Like I mentioned on the line, they did get 2 tight ends again. We could talk about quarterback if you want. I think there's a little bit
Mm-hmm.
of fatigue there with AJ Cerise and, having trouble getting traction in terms of a top QB. So you're just building depth there. But overall, I thought that, this is a solid class. I guess am I getting grumpier as I age? Just the whole, the same, there's two camps every year, right? There's the Rutgers fans that brag about Rutgers being ranked 8th in the country, in the first week of June when nobody has, not many schools have commits. And then there's the fans out there that are dumbfounded. How is Rutgers in the top 10? So you see that so much in June that it's just, I'm sick of it. But overall, I think this class is kind of, Rutgers with Shiano right now, they're at a baseline, right? They're in the 30 to 40 range year after year. I think we'll get into the geography of it. I think that's really interesting with this class. But I think they're at a solid level. But I think, there's going to be a lot of factors that are going to be required to be able to get them to elevate into that top 25 range, if at all, in the Shiano tenure.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I've said this stat before, so those of you who are bored of it can fast forward 15 seconds. But basically, the gap in terms of high school recruiting rankings between the top 9 is as big as the gap between number 10 and 50 when you look at that, right? And so that meant that to really finish in the top 4 for a college football playoff was really tough if you're not in that like top 10 basically. But now with the expanded field that may expand even further, you don't have to be there. Like you're going to have roughly equal talent if you're the 40th most talented team in the country with whoever is number, let's say 15. So depending on how the schedule breaks, you may get lucky. Like last year, if Rutgers would have played defense the way they did the year before, they might have been 10-2, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think that's where they need to be. And in my opinion, I mean, for the most part, and we can talk about the one knock probably being the lack of guys from New Jersey. But other than that, I mean, I think this program is operating a notch ahead of schedule compared to other programs in the country, whereas some of the other programs at Rutgers are like kind of behind the times a little bit. But football seems to be ahead of where everybody else is in terms of, identifying premium positions and figuring out, okay, these are the positions that we need to try to get in the high school class because they're going to be harder to find. Or like the main thing is the offensive line. Yeah, you can get them in the transfer portal if you are willing to pay and you have money, but that's a lot. Whereas if you get lucky and a Holland Pierce is a walk-on, like how much better that is for you. Like that's crazy. And then defensive line, I think when you look at it, right, they may have gotten a slight advantage for someone like Eric O'Neill in the transfer portal because he's a local guy, had this dream to play for Rutgers. But finding those guys in general year after year, you're not going to find it. Even if he's only a rotational pass rusher, he still commands a premium price just for that level. So you have to try to find those guys in the high school ranks if possible. And then if they're like a YD Collier and they can play as a true freshman or a redshirt freshman, great. Because allocating your resources year after year that in the transfer portal is just not sustainable for a program like Rutgers. And so I think they're kind of figured this out faster than a lot of other programs in the country, and they need to parlay that into wins now to kind of keep themselves ahead as these other schools continue to close the gap. But yeah, I mean, that's basically the takeaway from my perspective is I think they're prioritizing the right things position-wise and then figuring out like, hey, if we need to add a tight end or a linebacker, even a running back in the portal, we can if we need to. But we're going to swing for the fences for those positions in the recruiting class coming out of high school.
Yeah, I agree with you to your point. I mean, I think they know who they are in terms of their plan. They're obviously, Rutgers is very well organized as a recruiting staff. Credit to Shiano. I mean, they have a big staff, but just in terms of how they've approached high school recruiting, how they've approached the portal, how they've kind of molded that together in terms of their strategy, in terms of how they've prioritized retention of certain players. I think they have that figured out, and I agree. I think they are a little bit ahead of other schools, but I also think they have to be able to keep pace and not
Right.
take a step back. We had talked about last year was a little bit later, August, right? We looked ahead to this year, knowing there were going to be so much turnover on the roster, so many open spots, and we were pondering how are they going to deal with that. And I'm going to save one point that you want to make for you in a minute, but just in terms of how you approach the recruiting in high school, and this class, it's going to be very interesting. It's like they have the blueprint down, I think, for what they need to do as a program with all the factors that exist. But again, you never know with how players turn out. And I mean, we both saw the writing on the wall with someone like Jaylee Matthews that, great, he boosted up the rankings and all that, but neither of us thought he would ever materialize in anything. I don't think we thought he'd self-combust so quickly, but
Right.
it's rankings are subjective. Some people get a little like cranky about, oh, you're reading way too into it. I think our bigger point is that they're recruiting the right players for the program. They have a balance and a strategy to what they're doing. It's just going to come down to execution in terms of developing players and what they can get out of them. And we saw the gap last year in the middle of the year, and I'll kind of let you feed off of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the points that you kind of made at nauseum during last season accurately, and other podcasters picked up on it, was if you're going to call yourself a developmental program, what that means is you need a starter who is passable, and then you need another guy who can go in that spot that's either experienced, even if he's not as physically gifted as your typical Big Ten starter, let's say, but he is at least experienced enough to get by, or you need a guy who's younger that you can plug in with at least the physical ability to get in there, even if they're not fully developed. Like you saw Jabome last year, right? He got exposed at times, but he had the physical capability, the physical size, speed, power that he could make some plays. And even though he's far from a finished product, was still named third team All Big Ten. Now I'm not expecting that every position you're going to have a guy who's going to become a step in like that, but you need, and that's what kind of I think what they figured out is they need to be able to plug some of these backup roles with guys who at least have physical upside. That yeah, maybe they get burned if they're a DB, but at least they can hang with the receiver and they're not just getting the guy's just not running past them every time. And really, kind of this kind of happened with basketball first, but we were looking at 2025 before last season, trying to project like where Rutgers might be, and they were basically there halfway through last year, where the offense had already overtaken the defense as like this is an offense first team. A lot of the wide receivers that we thought maybe Chris Long and Christian Dremel might still be the guys, and then your Ian Strongs, KJ Duffs would be kind of like a year away, and Ben Black's that kind of flipped. All those things, linebacker depth, Kaj Sanders having to play, Gilly, Levy, all those guys in the defensive backfield all had to play in 2025 when we were, or I'm sorry, in 2024 when we thought they're going to have to play in 25. So basically, my point is the future comes earlier than it used to. And so Rutgers is already we're at the point we thought they would be at now in terms of where some of these younger guys were going to have to play. So that does two things. One, you can sell that in the recruiting. Like, hey, you can play right away in Big Ten if you have this physical ability. But then also, like as a coaching staff, you have to be ready to adapt. And hopefully the lesson that they learned from last year is that they got to be able to adapt more quickly. And as one of his mentors, Bill Belichick, kind of for Greg Schiano, was very good at that. So I'm hoping that, heading into this season, if they do need to make adjustments, they can do that and they're not willing or scared to play a true freshman if they have to, like they did. Whereas just because that guy isn't ready mentally necessarily, but he has some physical tools, they might be able to get by, whereas other guys might not be. And I think that's what they're going for in this class, and I think that's what we saw last year, and I think that trend's going to continue year over year.
Yeah, and it's a great point. I think, and I've mentioned this in the past about basketball, but I think part of what happened last year is that they were hamstrung by the fact that they had all these veterans that they were loyal to, that had, you know, their spots cemented. But then when they got hurt and they weren't performing at the level that they typically performed at, it was a lot harder or slower to adjust in terms of replacing them with a lot of unproven players, as you just mentioned.
Right.
Now, the flip side of that is how much does that benefit them this year going into it with a lot of young players that did get more reps than we anticipated? Because that was one thing we really harped on before the preseason was that you have so many proven players, you're not going to get reps for the younger guys, and that actually ended up not being true because of the injuries. But to your point, I think that was the frustration with October, is that they didn't adjust, you know, and they were maybe loyal to a fault, which again doesn't really hurt you in recruiting, but at the same time, I think did hurt them on the field. And I think this year, what's so interesting, and then you have that 25 class coming in, why I think it also applies to next year, because it's still going to be, I think, a pretty young team. And obviously the portal every year changes over. But just in terms of, you know, trying to fill those spots and being able to tinker, maybe having more freedom to tinker and give certain guys shots in certain spots that maybe you were hesitant to or really didn't have room to do in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we look at this year, the margin for error is pretty thin on getting to a bowl game, and so it's it might be tough. They might trust their older guys, but there's so many new faces. Like, I think your point about loyalty is not the same as you have, like, you know, a Desmond Igbinosun who's like a 3-year starter basically, that you're kind of loyal to, when you got Kai Sanders, who obviously isn't as taking as good of angles, but he has enough catch up speed that if the guy does get through, he can make a tackle, right? And so this year, it's like less of that, and it'll be interesting to see how some of the true freshmen, if called upon, will have to play. And again, I think they can sell that to some of the recruits. But the other thing is, I do expect they're going to take their lumps a lot of times this year in 25. So with these class of 26 guys, their eyes are going to be wide open to be like, hey, I might be able to play as a true freshman in 26, especially if I enroll early. And so that's definitely a positive thing for a program like Rutgers, where they need every advantage they can get for in the recruiting trail. And so I think, again, when I look at this class, there's a lot of guys that are rolling the dice on that maybe have physical tools, or they don't have a lot of tape at linebacker because they play quarterback in high school, for example. No, one of those was Shaw, who decommitted, but there's a couple other guys like that as well, like Tanner Raymond, for example. He's like a smooth athlete. He's fast. He's got some power, and maybe you catch a little bit of lightning in a bottle because he doesn't have the same, you know, experience that a guy like a zillion reps at a linebacker like other guys might have. So I do think it's the right approach to swing for the fences, and that's really to tie it back to this 26 recruiting class, which again they can't sign, and I know they don't know there's intent anymore, but they can't actually enroll until January of 2026. So they're basically verbally committed for the next 5 months before they can actually show up, unless they reclassify, which is a whole nother thing. But ultimately, I think that's where it kind of ties present and future, which again is coming faster than it ever has before. But that's kind of where I see this just high level where they are with the 26 recruits is finding guys who they have a chance of being really, really good. But they're also putting guys here who probably won't pan out.
Yeah, well, it's interesting how you bring up, you know, playing time as kind of a motivator, because when you look at the class geographically, only one New Jersey commit, and you're getting, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, 3, you know, the Pennsylvania 6, right? That's really that's a little bit high for Rutgers, but that's not so crazy. But 3 Virginia, 2 from Florida, 2 from Georgia, 2 from North Carolina. I mean, that's 9 recruits from the South. You have to imagine that playing time and opportunity was a big motivation for a lot of those players to come to Rutgers. And just, I think it's also interesting how they didn't tap into nearly as much of the Big Ten footprint as they have in the past. 2 from Ohio, 1 from Maryland, 1 from Michigan, 1 from New Jersey. Did get 1 from Connecticut, but I think that the geographical makeup of the class is interesting. Obviously, New Jersey was down this year. in terms of the class overall. But at the same time, there's a lot of really good schools that came in and got that top 10 in New Jersey. Even Syracuse got a couple right outside the top 15. Rutgers lone commit, is hovering around 29, 30 from New Jersey. Again, not that means everything, but I think part of it was strategic going in, knowing that the class maybe from a need perspective and from a ranking perspective wasn't as high as they were previously. So they targeted, a lot of regions that they have. Obviously, North Carolina, they've had success. They built the South now even more. Georgia. So to see them tap back into that was really encouraging. So I think as a whole, to your earlier point, Shiano and the staff, they continue to adapt. And I think that that's one thing. And it's not always with success, but at least they're constantly trying to stay ahead of the curve. I think that that's very admirable. And I think that's something that no matter how that Shiano 2.0 ends up, I think they were always making an effort to adjust as things were changing so rapidly. And I think you see a little bit of that just in terms of the geography with this class.
Yeah, well, I want to ask you that as a question, which was, and we probably should look back at, what happened after the 2010 season, 2013, et cetera, right? Because what we have to remember for a lot of these classes is your success in 24 season or lack thereof usually doesn't show up in 25. It shows up in 26, right? So these guys were mostly watching and being recruited based on 2024 season, even though they're 26 class. Right, which is why the 25 class last year, which I think will probably turn out to be slightly better, was based on the 23 results, which were only 6-6 regular season, but it felt like the program was moving forward. So the question I want to ask you is, that in mind, do you think that one of the reasons New Jersey is less represented in this class because New Jersey guys may be more attuned to the fact that this school fell short of expectations in the 24 season, whereas guys from, let's say, Virginia or not in the Big Ten footprint per se might just see, hey, they won 7 games, they won 4 games in the Big Ten, which is more than they've ever won, and just see that rather than reading the newspaper or whatever, online, NJ.com, I guess, for example, based on that Rutgers may have been short of expectations. Do you think that might be a reason they're doing better outside of New Jersey than inside New Jersey in this class?
I think that's a great point. I hadn't thought of that, but I do think there's some truth to that. I think they've always struggled with that to a degree in terms of New Jersey recruits, not really thinking Rutgers is cool to go to. And obviously so many blue bloods have come into New Jersey over the years. And again, I think what was interesting about New Jersey this year is even though it is down rankings wise, I mean, USC, Ohio State, Illinois, Washington, Penn State. I mean, 7 of the top 8 are Big Ten schools coming and getting, even though the talent as a whole, the top 10 was less than the year before. Again, rankings wise, might not end up being the case, but Rutgers really got beat there. So one thing I honestly can't touch on is how much did Rutgers pursue those guys versus in the past recruiting the top 10. But I do think, again, Shiano's pretty perceptive. So I could see how that type of image in the New Jersey recruits, knowing that this past year, even though it was a success, was not what a lot of people in the state had hoped, could have been a factor in the mindsets and kind of where they were at. You always make a great point about how it's kind of 2 years off in terms of 23 impacting 25, 24 impacting 26, which really makes this next season so crucial to 27 in terms of how they're able to, can they hold the line, in terms of not taking a step back. I think it's funny. It's like last year, 7-5. You could argue if they go 6-6 this year, it's almost more impressive than their 7-5 last year. So how that resonates with recruits remains to be seen. But I think it's multiple reasons. I think the fatigue of just kind of knowing they didn't have as good of a year as they should have impacted New Jersey. I think part of it was strategy because New Jersey was down. I think part of it was need in terms of who was available and the best players for the positions of need that Rutgers needed. But I also think there's a strategic mindset of Rutgers to really keep that pipeline in certain regions going, specifically the South and the Midwest. Just I think from a sustainability standpoint, year after year, where they can make those pivots based on how strong the local talent is versus, as you know, I mean, Rutgers in the past, they're so dependent on New Jersey. And if the tri-state area had a down year, they were pretty much out of luck. And you've seen, you see that across the country in multiple sports when a state has a ton of talent, they really benefit. And if they don't have that infrastructure of being able to go elsewhere when those years when they're not strong, it does really hurt them. So I think it's part of why they've been consistent, is that they have expanded their reach in a way that I think they haven't done nearly as much so in Shiano's previous tenure.
Yeah, the other thing I'll add to that is if you look back at recent class, like let's say Terrell Mitchell last year, right? One of the things that I think the staff is trying to do as part of their strategy is, like we saw the whole thing at the last minute was John Forster, who has like a real high profile, and then ultimately came down to him or Mitchell as that running back spot. Mitchell has a better senior year, and Rutgers pivots to him. Yep. So they might be, maybe they're overthinking it slightly, but they may benefit from kind of getting those sneaky New Jersey guys kind of last minute that then having to just stay with them the whole time over and over and over again. Stay with those guys, keep calling them, keep contacting them. It's kind of interesting, we talk about it. Basically, yeah, in short, commits are usually based on 2 years before. Decommits are usually based on that year. I know they've had a couple already, but when you see a mass exodus, it's usually because the team is just really fallen apart during that football season, and that's one of the reasons we haven't seen massive decommits over the last 2 years. But when I guess the best way to think about it is like in economics, we have the concept of comparative advantage. If you're Michigan, right, and you are deciding, okay, I can either go to Virginia, and really guys are spread out, other than maybe the DMV, but it's really spread out, or I can go to New Jersey and try to poach there. It's a better use of your time if you're Michigan to go to New Jersey and try to go hunting than going to Virginia in that example. So Rutgers, they're pretty smart, and they know that Rutgers, meanwhile, is going to Virginia, North Carolina, even Georgia, because it's a little further to go there, but Michigan, Ohio State is less incentivized to go down and get guys from Georgia unless they're 5 stars. And so Rutgers, I think, is using that kind of to their advantage. Like a lot of the guys in the research triangle, Duke, Chapel Hill, Wake Forest, NC State, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, all that. That's a really smart place to go because it's a little more spread out than New Jersey or the DMV, but it's not so spread out that you can't fly there in an hour and a half if you're the Rutgers staff. And so I think that's an area where they can have a slight advantage as the ACC continues to be in a little bit of limbo compared to the Big Ten. But yeah, I mean, I do think I think it's not a red flag yet that they're not getting as many guys in New Jersey, but maybe it's a yellow flag, and they really can't just let that go. So it'll be interesting, like you said, to monitor the situation moving forward.
Okay, so to tap into what you just said, is there any concern with the fact that these schools all got higher rated recruits in the state of New Jersey this class? Stanford, Boston College had 2, Syracuse had 2, Buffalo, Connecticut, BC had another, Pitt, UVA, Temple, another Syracuse, 2 NC State, and Rice all had players committed that are higher ranked. Now, again, we all, rankings are subjective and it's not the end of the world, but it is interesting that a lot of programs either kind of we consider at the same level or even below Rutgers all got higher ranked players than Rutgers did in this class.
Okay, I guess 3 points on that. One, let's talk about this in 6 months, right? Because those rankings might change. Rutgers seems to be a better evaluator than a lot of other teams early on, right? Number one.
I agree.
Number 2 is, again, at a 1-year sample size, that's still not a large enough data point to be super concerned if it's one blip on the radar, right? But if this is happening every year, obviously a major concern. And three, I think a big factor in this is the gravity of Fran Brown at Syracuse. I know not all of those guys were Syracuse, but you mentioned several who were, and they had a absolute clown show of a schedule last year, performed pretty well, and I think that their win over Miami late in the year, when not only did they win and kind of block Miami from reaching the college football playoff when they should have easily been in there without just complete debauchery, but that was like a national TV game. Everybody I know is watching it, even though it's Syracuse and Miami, a random ACC game. And so I think a lot depends. There's a lot riding on Fran Brown's success at Syracuse, not just for that Orangeman, or the Orange, I guess, as you call him now, but the entire ACC, because he does have some of that gravitas for some of those other teams you mentioned. And then also similarly with Bill Belichick, right? If North Carolina becomes a powerhouse under Belichick, which I'm not convinced they will be, but if they do, like that can significantly raise the profile of the ACC. Boston College are always going to get guys. And really, I guess the last point I would say is I haven't watched the film of every one of these guys, right? But Rutgers getting the like we talked about in basketball, like getting the 12th man on Michigan, like when Jeff Billett, your all-time favorite player, one of my all-time favorites, right? They can't have a full team of Jeff Billets, or they're not going to compete in the Big Ten. Like in football and basketball, they need to go for these guys with higher upside that may flame out, but that they have to roll the dice. And so again, I haven't watched the film of every single one of these guys that you're saying, but I do think the right move is to go with the guys with the physical gifts and hope you can develop them rather than a guy who may be a more complete package, but his upside is not as high. And yes, I think they've gotten a little bit lucky with like Kyle Monangai just being way better than anyone expected. Holland Pierce being a walk-on, right? You can't even, I mean, they get credit for it, but it wasn't even like they really recruited him. So they have gotten a little lucky, but
showed up in the
I
parking lot.
think that's more of my thing in football is like if their staff is realizing like we need to go for a guy who could be a like a guy on his current team like DJ Allen, right? He's never materialized, but he's huge. So if he does work out, like even though he was a lower ranked recruit, like that's what they need, right? And so that's kind of where I'm not as concerned. Again, if it's only a 1 year thing, but I do see, like you're saying, if this is happening year over year, then maybe there's a problem.
Yeah, and just one last thought there. Hot take on Syracuse going 10-3 last year with losses to Stanford and Boston College actually is a huge letdown with a quarterback like McCord and the schedule they had. They kind of blew it, even though, yes, perception-wise, they made major strides. They should have had a better season than they ended up having. So we know what that's
Right,
like.
but they beat Miami. If when you compare it side by side, I mean, I know Illinois. If Rutgers were to beat Illinois, went 8-4, compare that to Syracuse, with it, that would have been the same, right?
Yeah.
If Syracuse would have lost to Miami, I think they would have been in the same place as Rutgers is, where like they had a golden opportunity for college football playoff and they blew it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. So, all right. I guess any other final thoughts on this recruiting class? And, it sounds like they're pretty much where they're going to be. We know that they'll obviously add transfer portals, before players before the following season. So they keep certain slots available for that. Like we mentioned, they did have some recent decommits, but they're at 21 right now. Probably, maybe take one or two more high school kids. Probably not much more than that. So it is what it is. They're right now at 29th. They'll probably end up closer to about 40. We didn't really talk about player grade average. They are slightly behind last year. Right now, they're 11. They're 11th overall as a class in the Big Ten, but there's several schools behind them, including Iowa, Maryland, that have much higher player grade averages. Nebraska. So, even if this class finishes 39, if they finish 15th in the Big Ten, right, in terms of player grade average, all that. I mean, how I guess does that matter, or is it more of Rutgers being true to who they are, knowing that they're they believe they got the right fits for them, how much would you buy into how they stack up ranking wise against the other schools?
I guess, like, I keep harping on this, but it's like, do they want to finish 15th in the Big Ten every year? No. If it happens this year, is it okay? Probably. I mean, we have to expect decommits, right? We were kind of spoiled for the last 2 years that they had probably the fewest in the country,
Yeah,
definitely the fewest of any Power Four team, without a doubt. And when we're talking about decommits, it's like Edwards decommits and goes to Miami,
yeah,
not Sam Martin, the wide receiver during the Chris Ash era, decommits and goes to Miami of Ohio, right? We're talking Miami, Florida, Miami, Ohio. Like, this is, we're not even the same echelon of the conversation we're having. That's one thing. And then I think the main thing when I keep talking about this is like they need playmakers, and they seem to be figuring out how to find playmakers on offense, even as like an Antoine Raymond as a true freshman, even a Deshaun Benjamin, who was like a mid 3-star prospect, but him making second effort runs won that game or iced that game against Minnesota when Kyle Monangai was out.
yep,
Like, that was playmaker. That was a playmaker on the field. And they had that on offense. They did not have that on defense, partially due to the injuries last year. And so recalibrating, how are they going to find guys who, even if, yes, they need a certain aggregate size and speed on defense, but they need guys who can make plays that can turn the tide of those games, like Powell did in that Minnesota game, forcing that fumble. Like even Walker, the defensive end, did against Minnesota. Like, they need that on defense. And just because a guy's like a solid player for a big North team as like a linebacker, that doesn't necessarily translate to defensive playmaker in the Big Ten. And so I think that's where their focus is on defense, almost more like a old Big 12 style. Like, not don't forget about defense, but you got to generate turnovers. You got to generate big plays. Is
yeah,
more important on defense than just having, like, kind of like they had last year, like 11 roughly adequate guys and little depth. Like, that's not going to get it done against most schedules. Even like we saw last year, the year before they were kind of deceived because nobody chucked the ball that they played. It was only Maryland who slaughtered them, right? And so I think that their staff is kind of figuring that out when you look at the type of guys that they're targeting. But, that's really, to me, why I'm not concerned with what I see from this class overall, even if rankings wise, it's not even where it was a year ago. I think they're trying to swing for the fence, knowing that they can plug some holes in the transfer portal if they have to, and just swing for the fence for guys that they'll never be able to afford in the transfer portal if those guys were to work out, coming straight out of high school to Rutgers.
yeah. Excellent point. I think it's really interesting how, we're talking about recruiting strategy and how they're finding their guys and targeting playmakers. And they really have had a pretty dramatic shift from even, 3 years ago, even 2 years ago, where Shiano really played old school style, grind it out on defense, run it on offense, win 14-10. And you started, again, back to your point about midway last season, when we saw Kalik Manis start to click, the offense start to click. They started to open it up more. They were more aggressive in the pass game, even with Monangai, who did obviously, was dealing with some stuff. So they kind of had to a little bit out of necessity. But to your point about defense, I think that's really interesting in that, they've struggled making big plays on defense,
Right.
since Shiano's been back, other than the first game when they forced like 7 turnovers. And they've, there's been seasons where they've been midway and not even 7 turnovers. But to your point, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think that's where the athleticism, the speed, you have seen a real emphasis on that in recent classes. And I think, to your point about taking a flyer on somebody that has a skill set or a talent that could ultimately develop into something special, I think you are seeing a lot more of that now. And I think it's also feeding into the philosophy of how they want to play offensively and defensively. So I think that just outside of recruiting, how they do defensively that this year in that regard, in terms of obviously reducing big plays, being able to get takeaways. It's not necessarily about, shutting teams down and also,
Right.
limiting, 3-and-outs, all that kind of stuff. It's bending, not breaking, and having an offense good enough to win in that scenario.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up Hewitt, and when I look at Hewitt and Cruz, the two guys at defensive back, the only question there for is their size, right? They're playmakers, and we saw Christian Isian, undersized, make plays, become an NFL starter, right? And so if you have other guys who are, fit the bill for their positions, and my favorite comment that aged quite well was my concern last year that they didn't have enough guys on defense who were above average speed for their positions. That's not an exact correlation with playmaker, but it doesn't hurt. And when they didn't have Tyrene Powell, especially on the field, or Flip Dixon, like they couldn't make big plays on defense. Robert Longerbeam, though, ices the game against Virginia Tech, maybe wins the game. He won the game, but he maybe saved the game. If he doesn't make that interception, Virginia Tech scores a touchdown, they lose. If it goes to overtime, they probably lose. But if they could have made one other big play against Illinois on defense, they win that game. They could have made one more big play on defense against Kansas State, they win that game. If they could have made one more big play against UCLA, maybe they win that game. Like, so many of those games came down to a big play. And so, yeah, it's probable that Hewitt and Cruz will turn out to be too small, right? That's entirely possible. It wouldn't be the first time. But you have to roll the dice, because if a guy like that is a Christian Isian, or you see like at other schools like a Tyrann Mathieu, Honey Badger type, like that's an irreplaceable part of a defense. And that's kind of what they're trying to do with Elad this year, is to get a guy who's just fast, delivers a punch, but coming out of high school was not, a 4-star, 5-star recruit. But now, because of what he has turned himself into, he is. So they're trying to find those guys and hope that they can turn him into something. And so that's where, obviously, they addressed this in the transfer portal. Blue Eli in the defensive line, I think, is in the same mold, where it's not a guy they would have got out of high school, but they're kind of recalibrating like who they might want to try to get there. And so I'm hopeful that obviously it works out, because kind of like I said on Larry K's podcast with Night Watch, is like, no one wants them to win more than us. We were fans before these guys were coaching here. Before any of these players were even born, we were fans of Rutgers football, basketball, and, especially in your case, like soccer, me, baseball, right? Like, we want them to win. And I think that I'm giving the football staff a lot of credit, because I think off the field, they're doing almost everything they can to keep moving forward. And then the last point that I'll make, even with some of these decommits, is like, it's kind of like when you're dating and you break up with someone and you kind of tend to overcorrect. And so some of these guys, like you mentioned, these top, let's say 25 guys in New Jersey for this class, if they go to a school that ends up having coaching instability for whatever reason, a coach does well, goes to the NFL, coach doesn't do well, gets fired or whatever, they may overcorrect and be like, okay, what is the most stable program, local? For me, it's Rutgers. And so I fully expect at least a couple of those guys that Rutgers does not have signed right now, that they have built a positive relationship with, to come back. And so nowadays, the name of the game is just don't burn any bridges at all. And I think Rutgers has the stability that they're going to benefit from kind of that pendulum swing, where if it doesn't work out for somebody at another school, that they seem like a very, very stable option to return to, that likely also has playing time available.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's like, by not getting a lot of New Jersey guys out of high school, you're setting yourself up for potential big gets in the portal down the road, because you have that built-in home field advantage with those recruits. And I think also, it's going to be interesting to see, just in terms of how they're able to, you said you never want to burn bridges. It's like you never stop recruiting. Like, you never stop recruiting them, even though they're going to these schools. And I think, to your point, also just the stability that Rutgers has had, and their willingness to kind of, I also think it helps, like, those guys that are leaving the state to go to these schools. And if it doesn't work out there, Rutgers kept good relationships with them, but they also, like, look at us. We went out and we got who we needed to get in all these other places. almost makes them more desirable down the road. That is almost like a little play hard to get. That makes Rutgers wonder, well, maybe I messed up, not them. I messed up. I should have gone there, and they're kind of set up well for the future to kind of cherry pick guys that that might not work out if they didn't work out at one stop before, or they could just we've seen plenty of cases of guys leaving the state, coming back to Rutgers, and having success where they didn't in their initial stop.
Well, yeah, that was one of the things I was going to ask you, and I know we've been going for quite a while now, but it's like, do you think it's better for it to not work out for guys from out of state because it's kind of easier to sell that as like, hey, it just didn't work out, they're not from around here, than if you get 3 guys from St. Joe's Montvale or Del Barton or Hun School, and is that a harder sell on the recruiting trail? Like,
well, I think it's a relationship thing. I think if you have a lot of New Jersey guys that don't work out, right, there's question marks then with their high school coaches. And I think that impacts future years, where if you took a guy from Colorado and he didn't work out, like you said, he was homesick, or, he just didn't mesh well, it wasn't a culture fit, whatever. But if you miss on a lot of New Jersey kids, then you start to get question marks from those schools, in the future, and they might, be a little less willing to promote you to their kids in the future if it doesn't work out. Where obviously the flip side, if it does work out, it's huge. So there is that kind of boomer bust philosophy with New Jersey kids. And we've seen that. But also, Shiano has built such great credibility over the years by developing guys that weren't expected. And him take, that old rule about, and I know it's not going to probably, and he's lamented the fact that walk-ons are kind of disappear now with the revenue sharing and the roster limits and all that stuff. But, he always had a great rule about going to all the high schools and taking walk-ons. And that was something when Chris got here, he basically obliterated and got rid of. And that just kind of grassroots marketing and relationship building that way, I think, is one of the keys of Shiano's success on the recruiting trail in New Jersey over the years, is building those relationships. So to long-winded point of mine to answer your question is, I do think it's more damaging to not have kids from New Jersey work out. Part of that also is just, it's the media, right? In terms of they're going to harp on it more, but also I think the impact it could have down the road in relationships with the confidence factor with high school coaches in the state.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just to close the loop on that, like you look at Wisconsin, I think Jim Leonard, NFL solid player for many years, walk on Wisconsin guy, and they would talk about when he was their defensive coordinator, how important it was for, if somebody drives down to Madison from wherever they're from, literally Oshkosh, Wisconsin, right, where the phrase comes from, and they see, hey, this guy is from a 9-year-old kid, 8-year-old kid. They don't know who's on scholarship or who's a starter or who's an all-time great player at the school, but they see this guy is from Oshkosh, Wisconsin. That matters. I mean, obviously New Jersey is, I'm from Bergen County, so when I was there was 66 high schools. 60 became 63. Now it's maybe like 60. But even if there was nobody from Waldwick, which there never was, but there's guys from Bergen Catholic, St. Joseph's, Don Bosco. Like, we would be sitting there as kids being like, oh, there's someone from my area, and same thing. Iowa's always done the same thing when they've had success in Minnesota. And that's a page out of all of those schools that we talk about Rutgers trying to emulate in terms of their ceiling as a program. And so, yeah, I think that's a slight advantage that they may not have anymore with the roster limits. Like, one of those little edges that Shiano always had, and he was so buttoned up with, whereas a coach like Chris Ash never was, right? For as detail-oriented as he was, he just didn't get it the way Shiano did. And so Shiano will probably just find some other little advantage if he loses that one, because he's never going to stop working. And, it's obviously evident in how they've done in recruiting. And, yeah, would it be nice if they could recruit a little bit better guys? Yeah, but I think part of this is the growing pains of getting higher level athletes that, like Kelly, the decommit, right? He was committed to, I think, Toledo. Rutgers' first Power 4 offer, commits to Rutgers. And everyone's like, why has nobody else picked up on this guy? Like Pedro Serrano in Major League. But then, sure enough, now he's going to, I think, Alabama is his commitment. So, like, that was quick, where people were criticizing Rutgers for like he has no powerful offers to, oh, now he's going to Alabama. So, you know, it comes with the territory when you're battling with these type of other schools, or if a guy like, let's say Elias Koch, right? When I watched his film when he first committed, I was not that impressed. Then I watched his film from his junior year, and I'm like, okay, this guy could be a real beast. Clearly, Rutgers saw something in him before I did, which is why they get paid to do it, not us, right? And then now, if he has like a really big senior season, they're really going to have to fend off, other competition for a player like that, right? And so this is kind of par for the course when you're starting to reach these type of players that you're recruiting at this level. So I know we went a little bit long, but we haven't talked in a long time. Obviously, training camp is approaching soon, and the season's going to be here before we know it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think to your point that talking about Coke, and if he has a big senior year, it's again, you can never stop recruiting the guys that go elsewhere and your own guys. You can never stop recruiting them. And to your one thing you made me think of is when you were talking about those little edges. I think one thing we didn't really touch on is that with them going geographically all over the place, I think we're not accounting for the fact that revenue sharing could be kind of one of those things that is an edge for Schiano when he goes into these talent-rich states and he can grab the 40th top recruit in Georgia or Florida, and he can offer them real money that they can't get from, they might get an offer to Florida, but, maybe it's a walk-on offer, or maybe it's just, not a lot of money to go there, where
Right.
they can prioritize kids like that with revenue share now and give them a little bit of an advantage by being able to go in and differentiating themselves from, maybe the kid wants to go to Carolina, but they're not on the top of the list. But Rutgers comes in and they're going to get more money to go to Rutgers, not to mention the opportunity in terms of playing time. So I think that could be an angle that Rutgers is able to maximize.
Let me add to that too, which is this is where Rutgers not offering a million guys, I think, is a huge thing, because players are going to trust that if Rutgers says, "Hey, you have right," because step one is you have an offer. Step two is you have a committable offer. Now, step three, which maybe used to be under the table in a sport like basketball, especially, but now step three is this is how much money we would potentially give you, and they're not going to be in this like, in effect, in the NFL we call it salary cap hell, but in revenue sharing it would be, I guess, revenue sharing hell, where it's like, hey, we promised this guy this much and this guy this much. If they all take it, then we're screwed. Like because they don't offer 300 guys, I think that they're going to be less likely to handcuff themselves, and also that these players are going to trust that if this is what they say that they're going to get from Rutgers, they might get it. So yeah, Georgia might say you have a semi-committable offer. Maybe not Georgia, but let's say Georgia Tech. You have a semi-committable offer. This is how much we think we might pay you. But Rutgers says you have a committable offer. This is what we're going to pay you, even if it's slightly less. For any of us who have ever taken a job, we're like, well, if I feel much more confident that this is guaranteed, then I'm more likely to take that. And I do think that's, again, where Rutgers is going to be ahead of these other teams in terms of offering less guys and being more firm and less likely to kind of lose trust with people with some of the things that they're promising on the recruiting trail.
Totally agree. I think it also emphasizes even more, though, talent evaluation. You got to get it right. You can't miss those, and that then it could be a disaster. But no, this was fun. I miss talking to you like this. I hope everyone who listened and watched to this agrees. And we'll be doing more of this. We got some stuff planned leading up to the season, of course, and then obviously during the season. So we'll start to get a more regular schedule. We both have kids now. I can't really record during the day, so it makes it a little more challenging. But we're going to get our group back soon, and this was a start. So thanks so much for being here, Dave, and thanks so much for listening and watching once again here at the Scarlet Faithful podcast.